The colonel's laugh cut through Elena, like the shrapnel still buried near her heart. For 3 years, she had hidden her scars beneath pressed uniforms and perfect salutes. For 3 years, she had endured the headaches, the dizziness, the nightmares that came without warning. But when Colonel James Thornton called her a malingerer, when he mocked her invisible wounds with that cruel, dismissive laugh, Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez made a decision that would silence every doubt and change Fort Bragg forever. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, October 2024. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and comment below which city you're watching from. Now let's follow Elena's story to the very end. The summons came at 0600, delivered by a nervous private who couldn't meet Elena's eyes. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, Colonel Thornton wants to see you in his office. Immediately. Elena set down her coffee cup, her hand steady despite the cold knot forming in her stomach. She had known this moment would come eventually. 3 medical appointments in 2 weeks had apparently caught someone's attention. Did he say what it's about, Private? No, Sergeant. Just said immediately. Elena nodded and straightened her uniform. 28 years old, 8 years in the Army, 18 months in Kandahar province, and she still felt that familiar twist of anxiety when summoned by a superior officer. Some things never changed. The walk across base gave her time to prepare herself mentally. She knew Colonel James Thornton by reputation, and that reputation was not kind. 32 years of service had apparently convinced him that he could spot weakness from a mile away. Soldiers whispered about his interrogation-style meetings, his disdain for what he called soft soldiers, and his particular contempt for anyone who spent too much time in medical facilities. Elena touched her chest briefly, feeling the raised tissue beneath her uniform. The scars were invisible to everyone else, hidden by regulation clothing and sheer force of will. But she carried them everywhere, along with the 47 pieces of shrapnel that doctors had pulled from her body, and the 9 pieces that remained too dangerous to remove. She reached the administrative building and paused outside the colonel's office. Through the door, she could hear his voice, sharp and commanding, finishing a phone call. When silence fell, she knocked twice. "Enter." Elena stepped inside and snapped to attention. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez reporting as ordered, sir." Colonel Thornton didn't look up from the papers on his desk. He was exactly as Elena had imagined, tall even while seated, silver hair cropped military, short, broad shoulders that spoke of decades of physical discipline. His office walls displayed enough medals and commendations to fill a museum photographs of handshakes with generals and politicians, certificates of achievement spanning 3 decades. The silence stretched for a full minute before he finally raised his eyes. "Vasquez." He said her name like he was tasting something unpleasant. "I've been reviewing your service record." "Yes, sir." "Impressive on paper. Communications intelligence specialist with top security clearance. Deployment to Afghanistan. Several commendations." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I've noticed a pattern that concerns me." Elena kept her expression neutral. "Sir." Thornton leaned back in his chair and fixed her with steel-gray eyes that seemed designed for intimidation. "Medical appointments, Sergeant. 3 in the past 2 weeks. 7 in the past month. That's a lot of time away from your duties." "My appointments are documented and approved through the proper channels, sir." "I'm aware of what's documented, Sergeant. What I'm questioning is whether those appointments are necessary." He picked up a folder and opened it with deliberate slowness. "You're 28 years old. You appear to be in excellent physical condition. You passed your last fitness test with flying colors. So explain to me why you need to visit the medical facility more often than soldiers twice your age." Elena felt her jaw tighten, but kept her voice level. "Sir, my medical needs are legitimate. The base medical staff has determined that regular monitoring is required for my condition." "Your condition?" Thornton repeated the words with obvious skepticism. "And what exactly is this mysterious condition, Sergeant?" "I prefer not to discuss the specifics, sir. My medical information is private, and the relevant details are available through proper channels if you wish to request them." Something flickered in Thornton's eyes, something cold and dangerous. "Let me tell you something about proper channels, Sergeant. I've been in this army for 32 years. I've commanded soldiers in 3 different combat zones. I've seen every excuse, every dodge, every creative attempt to avoid responsibility that young soldiers can invent. And in my experience, when someone hides behind medical privacy rather than providing a simple explanation, it's because there's nothing legitimate to explain." The accusation hit Elena like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. "Sir, with all due respect, I am not making excuses. I take my duties seriously and have never failed to complete an assignment." "Is that so?" Thornton stood up slowly, unfolding his considerable height, and walked around his desk until he was standing just 3 feet from Elena. At 6'3", he towered over her 5'6" frame, a tactic clearly designed to intimidate. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've figured out how to game the system. Show up for duty most of the time, but whenever things get difficult or inconvenient, suddenly you need another medical appointment." Elena's hands trembled slightly behind her back. She pressed her fingernails into her palms, using the pain to anchor herself. "That is not accurate, sir." "Then enlighten me, Sergeant. What is so wrong with you that requires this constant medical attention but somehow leaves no visible trace?" He gestured at her with obvious contempt. "You stand straight. You speak clearly. You show no signs of any serious medical condition. So what am I supposed to think? Sir, appearances can be deceiving." "Can they?" Thornton laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls of his office and struck Elena like a slap across the face. "That's what they all say, Sergeant. Invisible injuries, hidden conditions, convenient ailments that flare up whenever duty calls. I've heard it all." He returned to his desk and sat down heavily, picking up her folder again. "I've seen real soldiers with real injuries, Vasquez. Men and women who've sacrificed everything for this country. I've watched soldiers lose limbs and fight their way back to active duty. I've seen warriors with burns covering half their bodies refuse to quit. Those are real injuries, real sacrifices, not this mysterious nonsense that only seems to appear when it's time for a medical appointment." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a pressure building that had nothing to do with the shrapnel near her heart. The colonel's words weren't just dismissive. They were an assault on everything she had survived, everything she had sacrificed, everything she had lost. "Sir, I completed my overseas deployment with distinction," she said, her voice beginning to show strain despite her best efforts. "Oh yes, your deployment." Thornton waved his hand dismissively. "I noticed that in your file. 18 months in Afghanistan, highly classified mission details, commendation for meritorious service. Very impressive." His tone made clear that he found it anything but impressive. "Let me guess, Sergeant. Something happened overseas, something classified that you can't talk about, and now you're using it as a get-out-of-jail-free card whenever the going gets tough?" The pressure in Elena's chest intensified. She could feel her pulse pounding in her temples, the beginning of a headache that had nothing to do with the shrapnel and everything to do with rage. "Sir, I don't use anything as an excuse." "Then what do you call 3 medical appointments in 2 weeks? Necessary monitoring. For what exactly? For a service-connected condition." Thornton slammed his palm down on his desk, making Elena flinch involuntarily. "That's not an answer, Sergeant. That's bureaucratic double-talk designed to hide behind regulations while you coast through your service." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena could hear her own breathing faster now than it should be. She could feel the familiar tension building in her shoulders, the hypervigilance that had become her constant companion since Kandahar. "You know what I think, Vasquez?" Thornton's voice dropped to a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than his shouting. "I think you're one of those soldiers who figured out that claiming some invisible injury is the perfect scam. Nobody can prove you're faking because there's nothing to see, and anytime someone questions you, you hide behind privacy regulations and classified information." Elena's control was slipping. She could feel it cracking like ice under pressure. "That is not true, sir." "Then prove it. Prove to me that you're not just another young soldier trying to game the system. Show me one piece of evidence that your medical appointments are legitimate." "My medical records are full of vague descriptions and technical jargon that could mean anything or nothing." Thornton cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I want something concrete, Sergeant. Something I can see with my own eyes." The challenge hung in the air between them. Elena knew she was at a crossroads. She could continue to maintain her privacy, endure his accusations, and accept whatever consequences came from his obvious hostility. Or she could show him the truth that she had kept hidden for 3 years. The laugh. It kept echoing in her memory. That cruel, dismissive laugh that reduced her sacrifice to nothing. That laugh that mocked the 3 soldiers who had died beside her, the surgeons who had spent 16 hours putting her back together, the rehabilitation specialists who had taught her to walk again. "Well, Sergeant," Thornton pressed. "Nothing to say, nothing to show." Elena met his eyes directly. "Sir, are you ordering me to disclose my medical condition?" Something shifted in Thornton's expression, a flicker of uncertainty that was quickly masked. "I'm asking you to justify why this army should continue to accommodate your supposed medical needs when you can't even explain what those needs are. And if I show you, sir, if I provide the proof you're demanding, then maybe I'll reconsider my assessment of your character." Elena took a deep breath. The decision crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She had spent 3 years hiding, 3 years pretending to be whole, 3 years protecting herself from exactly this kind of judgment. But the colonel's laugh had broken some barrier she had carefully maintained since the day she woke up in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center with tubes in her chest and fire in her veins. "Sir, you want proof." Her voice had changed, grown colder and harder. "Then watch carefully, because I'm only going to show you this once." Her hands moved to the collar of her uniform. She began unbuttoning with deliberate, measured movements. Thornton's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to alarm. "Sergeant, what exactly do you think you're doing?" "Providing the evidence you demanded, sir." Elena continued unbuttoning her fingers, steady now, her decision made. "This is highly inappropriate. You wanted to see proof of my medical condition?" She met his eyes without flinching. "You accused me of having nothing to show. You called me a malingerer, a system gamer, someone who hides behind invisible injuries. Well, Colonel, let me show you what invisible looks like." She pulled open her uniform shirt. Colonel Thornton's face went pale. His mouth dropped open. Every trace of arrogance and dismissiveness drained away, replaced by something that looked like horror. Across Elena's chest, covering her shoulders, and extending down her sides, was a landscape of devastation. Raised scars formed jagged lines where surgeons had cut her open to extract shrapnel. Smaller scars dotted her skin like craters on the moon, marking each place where metal fragments had torn through muscle and tissue. Some scars were silver, with age. Others still pink and angry-looking. Together they told a story of violence, survival, and pain that no words could adequately describe. July 14th. Elena said, her voice steady as stone. 4 years ago. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Thornton said nothing. He seemed incapable of speech. My convoy was delivering encrypted communication equipment to Firebase Phoenix. 6 vehicles, 23 personnel. We were 2 kilometers from our destination when the Taliban hit us with a daisy-chained IED. 3 explosive devices detonated in sequence to maximize casualties. She turned slightly, revealing more scars along her back, evidence of shrapnel that had entered from multiple angles. The first blast disabled our lead vehicle, the second hit our vehicle directly, the third caught us as we tried to evacuate the wounded. Elena's voice remained clinical detached, as if she were reciting facts from someone else's file. Corporal Marcus Williams was killed instantly. Specialist Rosa Reyes died trying to pull me from the wreckage. Private First Class James Thompson bled out before the medevac could arrive. I was thrown 15 feet from the vehicle and lost consciousness. Thornton finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. Sergeant, I had no idea. No, sir. You didn't. Elena's tone carried no accusation, only statement of fact. Because I don't talk about it. Because the details of that mission are classified. Because I chose to continue serving rather than letting what happened define me. She pointed to a cluster of scars near her heart. The surgeons at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center spent 16 hours operating on me. They removed 38 pieces of shrapnel from my body, but 9 pieces couldn't be extracted safely. She touched the area gently. 3 fragments are lodged near my aorta. 2 are embedded in the tissue surrounding my spine. 4 others are scattered through my chest cavity in positions that make removal too risky. The medical appointments, Thornton's voice cracked, are to monitor the movement of the shrapnel that's still inside me, sir. Sometimes the fragments shift. When they do, I experience severe headaches, dizziness, and temporary hearing loss. If the pieces near my aorta move wrong, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Thornton sat down heavily, looking suddenly old. His hands were shaking as he set Elena's folder on his desk. The doctors at Walter Reed told me I was lucky to survive, Elena continued. They said most people with injuries like mine don't make it off the battlefield, but I did. And when I recovered enough to return to duty, I chose to come back. Because serving my country matters more to me than hiding from what happened. She began buttoning her shirt, her movements precise and unhurried. You asked me to prove that my medical needs are legitimate, Colonel. You accused me of gaming the system, of faking invisible injuries, of using classified information as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Each button she fastened seemed to punctuate her words. Now you've seen the truth. These are my invisible injuries. This is what I carry every single day. And until 5 minutes ago, you were absolutely certain that I was faking. The silence that followed was deafening. Thornton stared at his desk, unable to meet her eyes. His whole body seemed to have collapsed inward, as if the weight of his words was crushing him. How many other soldiers have you dismissed, Colonel? Elena's question was quiet, but piercing. How many others have you accused of malingering without ever asking what they survived? How many service members are hiding their wounds right now because they're afraid of exactly this kind of reaction? Thornton shook his head slowly. I don't know. No, sir, you don't. Elena finished the last button and straightened her collar. Permission to be dismissed. But the colonel wasn't done. He looked up at her with something she hadn't expected to see in his eyes. Not just shame. Not just guilt. Something deeper. Something personal. Something that suggested her revelation had struck a nerve far beyond what she had intended. Sergeant Vasquez, wait. Elena paused her hand on the door handle. Sit down, please. It wasn't an order. It was a request delivered in a voice stripped of all authority and pretense. Elena hesitated for a moment, then turned and sat in the chair facing his desk. Thornton was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on a photograph on his desk that Elena couldn't see from her angle. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. My son was a Marine, Sergeant Derek Thornton. He served 2 tours in Fallujah. Elena said nothing, sensing that any interruption would break whatever dam had begun to crack inside the colonel. He came home from his 2nd tour different, angry all the time, couldn't sleep, jumped at loud noises. His wife told me something was wrong, but Thornton's voice broke. He took a moment to compose himself. I told him to tough it out. I told him that real soldiers don't complain about their problems. I told him that seeking mental health support would be seen as weakness and would damage his career. The colonel's hands were trembling visibly now. Derek stopped talking to me after that. Stopped talking to everyone, really. His wife left. His friends pulled away. And I just kept telling myself that he needed to be stronger, that whatever was bothering him wasn't that serious. Elena felt her anger beginning to shift into something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like compassion. 3 years ago, Derek put his service pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Thornton spoke the words flatly, mechanically, like a man reciting facts he had repeated so many times they had lost their power to wound him. He left a note. It said that he had tried to ask for help, but no one would listen. No one believed him. No one could see his invisible wounds. The confession hung in the air between them. Elena understood now why the colonel had reacted so strongly to her medical appointments, why he seemed to have such contempt for invisible injuries. He wasn't trying to catch malingerers. He was trying to avoid confronting his own guilt. I've spent 3 years hating myself for what I said to my son, Thornton continued. 3 years knowing that my words, my attitude, my dismissiveness contributed to his death. And apparently I've been taking that guilt out on soldiers like you. Soldiers who remind me of what I failed to see in Derek. He finally looked up at Elena, and she saw that his eyes were wet. I owe you an apology, Sergeant Vasquez. Not just for what I said today, but for everything I represent. Everything I've become. Sir, no, let me finish. Thornton held up his hand. What I did to you in this office was inexcusable. I attacked your character. I mocked your injuries. I treated you exactly the way I treated my son, and I never even considered that I might be wrong. He stood up slowly, seeming to have aged a decade in the past 20 minutes, and walked to his window. Looking out at the base, he spoke with his back to Elena. How many others have I done this to? How many soldiers have I accused of faking, of malingering, of gaming the system? How many of them are struggling right now because their commanding officer made them feel ashamed to seek help? Elena didn't answer. The questions weren't really meant for her. Sergeant Vasquez, I need to ask you something. Thornton turned to face her. And I need you to be completely honest with me, even if the truth is hard to hear. Yes, sir. Am I the problem? The question came out raw, unfiltered. Not just me personally, but officers like me. Leaders who have been trained to see weakness everywhere, who pride themselves on spotting malingerers who think that tough love and dismissiveness are effective leadership tools. Are we the reason soldiers suffer in silence? Are we the reason people like my son feel like they have nowhere to turn? Elena considered the question carefully before answering. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. When I woke up in that hospital in Germany, surrounded by tubes and machines, the first thing I felt wasn't pain. It was fear. Not fear of dying, sir. Fear of what my injuries would mean for my career. Fear of how my fellow soldiers would see me. Fear that I would be labeled as damaged goods and pushed out of the army I had dedicated my life to. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I spent 2 years in rehabilitation, learning to walk again, learning to manage the pain, learning to live with shrapnel inside my body. And every single day I was terrified that someone would find out the full extent of my injuries and decide I wasn't worth keeping. So you hid them. I minimized them, sir. I never talked about the classified aspects of that mission. I never told anyone about the nightmares or the panic attacks or the moments when a car backfiring sends me diving for cover. I learned to smile through the headaches and explain away the dizziness and pretend that everything was fine. Elena met the colonel's eyes directly. And when I finally couldn't hide anymore, when the medical appointments became too frequent to ignore, my first instinct was still to lie, to make excuses, to protect myself from exactly the kind of judgment you showed me today. Thornton absorbed her words in silence. You asked if you're the problem, sir. The honest answer is that you're part of a culture that makes soldiers feel ashamed to be wounded. A culture that celebrates physical toughness while dismissing invisible injuries. A culture that treats seeking help as weakness and suffering in silence as strength. And that culture killed my son. That culture is killing soldiers every day, sir, not just through suicide, through untreated PTSD that destroys families, through chronic pain that leads to addiction, through traumatic brain injuries that go undiagnosed because soldiers are afraid to report their symptoms. Thornton walked back to his desk and sat down heavily. What would you do, Sergeant, if you were in my position, if you had the power to change things? What would you do? The question surprised Elena. She had expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps dismissal. She hadn't expected the colonel to ask for her guidance. I would start by admitting that I was wrong, sir. Publicly. To every soldier who has ever been accused of malingering without evidence. To every service member who has ever been made to feel ashamed for seeking medical care. What else? I would implement mandatory training on service-connected conditions. Not just physical injuries, but TBI, PTSD, chronic pain, all of it. Every officer and senior NCO should understand what invisible wounds look like and how to support soldiers who are struggling. Go on. I would establish an open-door policy specifically for medical issues. Make it clear that seeking help will never be held against anyone. That soldiers can come to their commanding officer with their concerns without fear of judgment or retaliation. Elena found herself warming to the topic, drawing on 3 years of frustration and observation. I would personally visit the medical facility, not to check up on soldiers, but to learn, to understand what doctors and nurses deal with every day, to build relationships with the people who treat invisible wounds. Thornton was writing notes on a pad of paper, his pen moving rapidly. What about accountability? How do we hold leaders responsible for the way they treat wounded soldiers? That's harder, sir, but it starts at the top. When senior leaders model the behavior they expect, when they openly discuss their own struggles and their own mistakes, it gives permission for everyone else to do the same. The colonel stopped writing and looked at her. Would you be willing to help me, Sergeant Vasquez? Help you, sir. What you've just described, these changes you're proposing, I don't know how to implement them on my own. I don't have the perspective. I've spent 32 years seeing things one way, and I clearly need someone to show me a different approach. Elena hesitated. An hour ago, this man had accused her of faking her injuries, had mocked her medical needs, had laughed at her invisible wounds. Now he was asking for her help. Sir, I'm not sure I'm qualified. You're the most qualified person I know, Sergeant. You've survived what most people can't imagine. You've continued to serve despite pain that would break lesser soldiers. And you had the courage to show me the truth when I was too blind to see it. He stood up and extended his hand. Will you help me fix what I've broken? Will you help me create something better for soldiers like you and for soldiers like my son? Elena looked at his outstretched hand. She thought about Marcus Williams, Rosa Reyes, and James Thompson, the 3 soldiers who had died in that convoy while she had somehow survived. She thought about the young service members she had met over the years who were hiding their own wounds, too afraid to seek help, too ashamed to admit they were struggling. She thought about Derek Thornton, a Marine she had never met, whose death might have been prevented if someone, anyone, had listened to his invisible wounds. Elena reached out and shook the colonel's hand. I'll help you, sir. But I have conditions. Name them. First, no half measures. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Full commitment, full resources, full support from leadership. Agreed. Second, I want to be involved in every decision, not as a token enlisted voice, but as a genuine partner in creating this program. Agreed. Third, and this is non-negotiable, sir. Elena held his gaze firmly. You need to apologize. Not just to me, to every soldier on this base who has ever felt dismissed or ignored when they tried to seek help. Publicly. On the record. Colonel Thornton nodded slowly. That's the hardest one. That's why it matters most, sir. He was quiet for a long moment, then extended his hand again. Agreed, Sergeant Vasquez. All 3 conditions. Now let's get to work. As Elena shook his hand for the second time, she felt something shift in her chest, right near the place where the shrapnel fragments still lodged against her aorta. It wasn't pain. It was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was hope. The news spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire. Colonel James Thornton, the man who had built his reputation on being the toughest, most unforgiving commander on base, had called an all-hands meeting. No one knew why, but everyone was talking. I heard he's retiring, Specialist Davis whispered to Elena as they walked toward the assembly hall. Something about a personal crisis. I heard he got reprimanded by the brass, Corporal Reyes added. Word is he crossed a line with one of the NCOs. Elena said nothing. She knew the truth, but it wasn't her story to tell. Not yet. The assembly hall was packed with soldiers from every unit under Thornton's command. Nearly 800 men and women stood in formation, their voices a low murmur of speculation and confusion. Elena took her place among her fellow communication specialists and waited. When Colonel Thornton walked onto the stage, the murmuring stopped instantly. 800 soldiers snapped to attention, their movements synchronized by years of training. But something was different about the colonel today. His shoulders, usually squared with military precision, seemed to carry an invisible weight. His face, normally a mask of stern authority, showed lines of exhaustion that Elena hadn't noticed before. At ease, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word. 800 soldiers shifted their stance, but kept their eyes locked on their commanding officer. The silence was absolute. Thornton gripped the podium with both hands, knuckles white. He stared out at the assembled soldiers for a long moment before speaking. 3 days ago, I made a terrible mistake. The murmur returned louder this time. Soldiers exchanged glances of confusion and disbelief. Colonel Thornton admitting to a mistake was unprecedented. I called a soldier into my office, he continued, his voice growing steadier. A decorated communications specialist with an exemplary service record. I had reviewed her file and noticed frequent medical appointments. And without asking questions, without seeking to understand, I accused her of faking her condition. Elena felt the eyes of nearby soldiers beginning to shift toward her. Word had apparently gotten out about their meeting, even if the details remained unknown. I called her a malingerer. I suggested she was gaming the system. I laughed at the idea that she might have invisible injuries. Thornton's voice hardened with self-directed anger. I laughed. The assembly hall had become so quiet that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. That soldier showed me her scars. Scars from 47 pieces of shrapnel that tore through her body during an IED attack in Afghanistan. Scars from 16 hours of surgery. Evidence of an injury that nearly killed her and continues to affect her daily life. Thornton released the podium and stepped to the side, looking directly at the assembled troops, rather than hiding behind the wooden barrier. I was wrong, completely inexcusably wrong, and I owe that soldier and every soldier I have ever dismissed without understanding a profound apology. He found Elena in the crowd and spoke directly to her. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, I am sorry, not just for what I said, but for the culture I have perpetuated, a culture that makes soldiers afraid to seek help, a culture that treats invisible wounds as fake wounds, a culture that may have cost my own son his life. A gasp rippled through the assembly. Colonel Thornton's son. The rumors had circulated for years, whispered stories about a Marine who had taken his own life, but no one had ever confirmed the connection. My son Derek was a Marine sergeant who served 2 tours in Fallujah. Thornton continued, his voice thick with emotion. He came home struggling with what we now recognize as severe PTSD. When he tried to tell me something was wrong, I told him to tough it out. I told him that seeking help would be seen as weakness. Thornton paused, composing himself with visible effort. Derek killed himself 3 years ago, and his final note said that no one would listen. No one believed him. No one could see his invisible wounds. The silence in the assembly hall was no longer just quiet. It was sacred. 800 soldiers stood witness to their commanding officer laying bare his deepest failure and his greatest loss. I have spent 3 years taking that guilt out on soldiers like Sergeant Vasquez. Soldiers who remind me of what I failed to see in my own son. And I am done. He straightened his spine, and some of the old command presence returned to his bearing. Effective immediately, I am implementing new policies regarding medical care and invisible wounds. Mandatory training for all officers and senior NCOs. An open-door policy for medical concerns. A complete overhaul of how this command treats soldiers who are struggling. Thornton looked out at the assembled troops with an intensity that demanded attention. If you are hurting, I want you to know that seeking help is not weakness. It is strength. If you are struggling with wounds that no one can see, I want you to know that those wounds are real and deserving of treatment. And if anyone in this command makes you feel ashamed for seeking care, I want you to report it directly to me. He stepped back to the podium for his closing words. Staff Sergeant Vasquez has agreed to help me build a better system. A system that might have saved my son's life. A system that will save others. I ask for your patience as we figure this out, and I ask for your courage in coming forward if you need help. Colonel Thornton snapped to attention and delivered a salute not to the flag behind him, but to the assembled soldiers before him. That is all. Dismissed. The formation broke, but no one moved. For a long moment, 800 soldiers stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Then slowly one soldier began to clap. Then another. Then a dozen. Within seconds, the entire assembly hall erupted in applause. Elena felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She watched as soldiers around her clapped, many of them crying as openly as she was. Colonel Thornton stood on the stage, accepting the response with obvious discomfort, his own eyes glistening. When the applause finally faded, soldiers began approaching Elena. Not to ask questions about her injuries, but to thank her. My husband has been struggling since his deployment, a staff sergeant from logistics told her, gripping her hand tightly. He's been too afraid to seek help. After today, I think he might actually do it. I've been hiding my TBI symptoms for 2 years, a young corporal admitted quietly. I thought if I said anything, my career would be over. But if the colonel can admit he was wrong, maybe I can admit I need help. The responses kept coming one after another. Soldiers who had been suffering in silence, who had been hiding their invisible wounds, who had been afraid of exactly the kind of judgment that Colonel Thornton had demonstrated just days before. Elena listened to each one, offering what comfort and encouragement she could. But her mind was racing ahead to the work that awaited her. This was just the beginning. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the chief medical officer at Fort Bragg's medical facility, was waiting when Elena arrived at her office later that afternoon. The doctor was a small woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that had clearly seen too much suffering. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," she said, rising to shake Elena's hand. "I've heard a great deal about you. The colonel has been here 3 times in the past 2 days asking questions about invisible wounds, treatment protocols, everything. He mentioned that you were the catalyst for his change of heart." Elena shifted uncomfortably. "I just showed him the truth, ma'am. He made the choice to do something about it." "Still, it took courage. Please sit down." Dr. Martinez gestured to a chair and took a seat across from her. "The colonel asked me to work with you on developing new training materials. He wants every leader on this base to understand what soldiers with service-connected conditions are dealing with." "That's the plan, ma'am." "Good, because frankly we need this desperately." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious. "Do you know how many soldiers on this base are currently struggling with invisible injuries?" Elena shook her head. "Neither do I, and that's the problem. We have official numbers for diagnosed conditions, but those numbers only capture soldiers who have sought treatment. My estimate based on 20 years in military medicine is that the actual number is at least 3 times higher. 3 times, possibly more. Soldiers don't report symptoms because they're afraid of how their commanders will react. They don't seek treatment because they think it will end their careers. They suffer in silence until the suffering becomes unbearable. And then," Dr. Martinez's voice trailed off. "And then they become statistics," Elena finished quietly. "Exactly. The suicide rate among active duty service members has been climbing for years. The rates of substance abuse, domestic violence, and mental health crises have all increased. And every time I lose a patient, I wonder if they might have survived, if they had felt safe enough to ask for help sooner." Elena thought about Derek Thornton, a Marine she had never met, whose death had set all of this in motion. She thought about the soldiers who had approached her after the assembly confessing their own hidden struggles. She thought about herself hiding her scars for 3 years, terrified of judgment. "So where do we start, ma'am?" Dr. Martinez smiled, the first genuine smile Elena had seen from her. "We start by teaching leaders what to look for. Not just physical symptoms, but behavioral changes. Withdrawal from social activities, increased irritability, sleep disturbances, difficulty concentrating. These are often the first signs that something is wrong, but most commanders aren't trained to recognize them. And even if they do recognize them, they might dismiss them." "Exactly, which is why we need to change the culture, not just the knowledge. We need leaders who understand that asking about a soldier's well-being is part of their job, not an intrusion on personal privacy." They spent the next 2 hours outlining a training curriculum. Dr. Martinez contributed her medical expertise, explaining the neurological and psychological mechanisms behind conditions like PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Elena contributed her lived experience, describing what it felt like to struggle with invisible wounds while trying to maintain professional composure. By the time they finished, they had a rough framework for a program that could genuinely change how Fort Bragg treated its wounded warriors. "One more thing," Dr. Martinez said as Elena prepared to leave. "The colonel wants you to be a guest speaker at the first training session. He thinks your story will have more impact coming from a fellow soldier than from a medical professional." Elena's stomach tightened. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. Showing my scars to the colonel was one thing. Telling my story to a room full of officers is something else entirely." "I understand, and no one will force you to do anything you're not ready for." Dr. Martinez placed a gentle hand on Elena's arm. "But consider this. Your story has already changed one man's life. Colonel Thornton will never be the same after what you showed him. Imagine what could happen if you shared that same truth with others. Elena promised to think about it, but as she walked back to her barracks, she already knew what her answer would be. The scars she had hidden for so long were demanding to be seen. The wounds she had carried in silence were insisting on being heard. She had spent 3 years being invisible. Maybe it was time to step into the light. The first training session was scheduled for the following week, and Elena spent every available moment preparing. She wrote and rewrote her remarks, trying to find the balance between clinical detachment and emotional vulnerability. She practiced delivering her story to an empty room, timing herself, to ensure she covered everything important without going on too long. But nothing could truly prepare her for the moment she walked into the conference room and saw 40 senior officers and NCOs waiting to hear her speak. Major Jessica Torres, a company commander with a reputation for toughness, sat in the front row with her arms crossed. Captain Anthony Garcia, a veteran of multiple deployments, occupied a seat near the back, his expression unreadable. Master Sergeant William Chen, one of the most respected senior NCOs on base, had positioned himself directly in the center of the room. Colonel Thornton stood at the front, waiting to introduce her. When he saw Elena enter, he offered a small nod of encouragement. "Thank you all for being here," Thornton began. "As you know, we've implemented new policies regarding support for soldiers with service-connected medical conditions. But policies are just words on paper unless we understand why they matter." He gestured for Elena to join him at the front of the room. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez is going to share her story with you today. I ask that you listen with open minds and open hearts. What she has to say could change how you lead and possibly save lives." Elena stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. 40 pairs of eyes fixed on her, expectant and skeptical. "2 weeks ago," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I was called into Colonel Thornton's office. He had noticed my frequent medical appointments and wanted an explanation. When I told him my medical needs were legitimate but private, he accused me of malingering. He laughed at the idea that I might have invisible injuries." She saw several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Good. Discomfort was the beginning of change. "I have 47 scars on my body from an IED attack in Kandahar province. I have 9 pieces of shrapnel still lodged inside me, including 3 fragments near my aorta that could kill me if they shift wrong. I have headaches that feel like someone is driving nails into my skull. I have nightmares that wake me up screaming. I have panic attacks that come without warning." Elena paused, letting her words settle over the room. "And until I showed the colonel my scars, he was absolutely certain I was faking." The silence was heavy, weighted with the implications of what she was saying. How many of you have dismissed a soldier's medical concerns without fully understanding what they were dealing with? No one raised their hand, but Elena saw guilt flash across several faces. How many of you have made assumptions about a soldier's fitness based on their appearance? Still no hands, but the guilty expressions multiplied. How many of you have soldiers in your units right now who might be struggling with invisible wounds, but are too afraid to seek help because they don't think you'll believe them? This time, several hands rose hesitantly. That's who we're here for today. Not for me. My story is already known. But for the soldiers in your units who are suffering in silence because they've learned that invisible wounds aren't taken seriously. She spoke for 45 minutes, sharing details of her injury, her recovery, her struggles to maintain her career while managing chronic pain and psychological trauma. She talked about the soldiers who had approached her after the assembly confessing their own hidden battles. She talked about Derek Thornton using his story, with the colonel's permission, as an example of what happened when invisible wounds went unacknowledged. When she finished, Major Torres was the first to speak. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I owe you an apology." Elena looked at her in surprise. "Ma'am, I have a soldier in my unit, Specialist Davis. She's been requesting frequent medical appointments, and I've been giving her a hard time about it, questioning her commitment, suggesting she needed to toughen up." Torres's voice cracked slightly. "After hearing your story, I realize I may have been making her situation much worse. It's not too late to change that, ma'am." No, it's not." Torres stood up, her eyes wet, but her jaw set with determination. "When I get back to my unit, I'm going to have a very different conversation with Specialist Davis. And I'm going to apologize." Captain Garcia spoke next, his voice gruff with emotion. "I've been dealing with hearing loss from repeated exposure to explosions. I've been denying it for 3 years because I didn't want anyone to think I was weak." He took a deep breath. "Listening to you talk about facing your injuries head-on has made me realize I need to get help." One by one, officers and NCOs shared their own stories. Hidden injuries, dismissed symptoms, soldiers they had failed. The training session became something more than education. It became a collective confession, a shared acknowledgement that the culture of toughness had been causing genuine harm. Master Sergeant Chen was the last to speak. He had remained silent throughout the session, his weathered face revealing nothing. 23 years in the Army," he said slowly. "I've seen a lot of soldiers come and go. Some I remember as heroes, some I remember as problems." He looked directly at Elena. "I would have remembered you as a problem staff sergeant. Before today, if I had seen your medical record, I would have flagged you as someone to watch. Someone who might be gaming the system." Elena felt a flash of anger, but suppressed it. She had learned that honest admission was more valuable than defensive silence. "I would have been wrong," Chen continued, "and I probably have been wrong many times with other soldiers. That ends today." He stood up and crossed the room to stand before Elena. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he extended his hand. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant, for having the courage to show us what we needed to see." Elena shook his hand, feeling something unlock in her chest. The scars beneath her uniform seemed to pulse with warmth, as if acknowledging that they had finally served their purpose. After the training session ended, Elena found herself surrounded by officers wanting to ask questions, share their own experiences, and learn more about how they could better support their soldiers. She spent another hour answering questions, offering suggestions, and listening to stories that echoed her own. When the room finally emptied, Colonel Thornton approached her. "That was remarkable, Sergeant Vasquez. I've never seen a training session have that kind of impact." "It wasn't me, sir. It was them. They were ready to hear it." "Maybe, but someone had to be brave enough to say it." Thornton paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've been in contact with General Morrison at Army headquarters. She wants to meet with us." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "General Morrison, sir." "Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. She's heard about what we're doing here, and she's interested in potentially expanding it beyond Fort Bragg." The implications were staggering. What had started as one soldier showing her scars to one dismissive colonel was now attracting attention from Army leadership. "When does she want to meet, sir?" "Next week. She's flying in specifically to see our program in action." Thornton placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "I know this is moving fast, and I know you never asked for any of this, but you've started something important, Sergeant, something that could help thousands of soldiers." Elena thought about Marcus Williams, Rosa Reyes, and James Thompson, the 3 soldiers who had died in that convoy while she had survived. She had spent years wondering why she had lived when they hadn't. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe her survival had a purpose she was only now beginning to understand. "I'm ready, sir." "Good." Thornton nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "Because this is just the beginning." That night, Elena sat alone in her barracks room, looking at a photograph she kept hidden in her footlocker. It showed her convoy team taken just days before the attack. Marcus Williams stood on her left, his arm draped over her shoulder. Rosa Reyes knelt in front, flashing a peace sign. James Thompson stood slightly apart, his shy smile barely visible beneath his helmet. She touched each face gently, feeling the familiar ache of survivor's guilt that never fully disappeared. "I'm trying," she whispered to the photograph. "I'm trying to make it mean something. I hope you can see that." The faces in the photograph didn't answer. They never did. But for the first time in 4 years, Elena felt like she might finally be honoring their memory in a way that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Thornton. "The training roster for next week is already full. We had to add 2 additional sessions to meet demand. Word is spreading." Elena smiled and typed a response. "Then we better be ready." She set down the phone and looked at the photograph one more time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to turn her pain into purpose. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The scars on her chest seemed lighter somehow, as if they had finally found their meaning. General Patricia Morrison arrived at Fort Bragg on a Tuesday morning, and the entire base seemed to hold its breath. Elena had seen photographs of the Deputy Chief of Staff for personnel, but nothing prepared her for the woman's commanding presence. Morrison stood barely 5'4", but she carried herself like she was 7 feet tall. Her silver hair was cropped military short, her uniform immaculate, her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Morrison said, extending her hand. "I've heard remarkable things about you." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored by your visit." "Don't be honored yet. I'm here to determine whether what you've built is real or just good public relations." Morrison's tone was brisk, businesslike. "I've seen too many initiatives that look impressive on paper but fall apart under scrutiny. Convince me this is different." Colonel Thornton stepped forward. "General, if I may, I'd like to start by showing you our training program in action. We have a session scheduled for this afternoon." "Fine. But first I want to speak with Staff Sergeant Vasquez alone." The request surprised everyone, including Elena. Thornton hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Of course, ma'am. My office is available." "Not your office, Colonel. Somewhere neutral." Morrison turned to Elena. "Walk with me, Sergeant." They walked in silence for several minutes, moving away from the administrative buildings toward a quiet area near the base chapel. Elena's mind raced with questions she didn't dare ask. Why did the general want to speak privately? What was she looking for? Morrison finally stopped and turned to face her. "Tell me about the day you showed Colonel Thornton your scars." Elena swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I want to hear it from you. Not the official version, not the sanitized story you've been telling in training sessions. The real thing." Elena took a deep breath. "He laughed at me, ma'am, called me a malingerer, said I was gaming the system. He was so certain I was faking that he demanded proof." She paused, feeling the old anger rise in her chest. "So I gave him proof. And what did that feel like?" The question caught Elena off guard. No one had asked her that before. Everyone wanted to know about the impact, the policy changes, the institutional transformation. No one had asked how it felt to expose her deepest wounds to a man who had just mocked her. It felt like dying, ma'am, and being reborn at the same time. Morrison nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "I had a daughter," she said quietly. "Captain Sarah Morrison, Army nurse. She served 3 tours in Iraq." Elena noticed the past tense immediately. Sarah came home from her 3rd deployment different, withdrawn, angry. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't maintain relationships. She tried to tell me something was wrong, and Morrison's voice faltered for just a moment. "I told her she needed to be stronger. I told her that Morrison women don't complain about their problems. Elena felt her chest tighten. Another parent. Another child lost to invisible wounds. Sarah died by suicide 4 years ago. She was 32. I'm so sorry, ma'am. Don't be sorry. Be effective. Morrison's voice hardened with determination. I've spent 4 years trying to change the system that failed my daughter. 4 years pushing for policy reforms that get watered down by bureaucracy. 4 years watching more soldiers die because we can't figure out how to help them. She turned to face Elena directly. And then I heard about Fort Bragg, about a colonel who publicly apologized to his troops, about a sergeant who showed her scars and changed everything, about a program that's actually working. It's still early, ma'am. We've only been running for a few weeks. I know, but the preliminary numbers are remarkable. The medical facility reports a 40% increase in soldiers seeking treatment for service-connected conditions. Unit commanders are reporting improved communication with struggling soldiers. And most importantly, you've had 0 suicide attempts since the program launched. Elena hadn't known that last statistic. The weight of it settled over her like a heavy blanket. I didn't come here to evaluate your program, Sergeant Vasquez. I came here to learn how to replicate it. The afternoon training session was the most important one Elena had ever conducted. General Morrison sat in the front row, her notepad open, her pen, moving constantly as she documented everything. Beside her sat Colonel Thornton, visibly nervous, in a way Elena had never seen before. The audience was different today, too. Word of the general's visit had spread, and officers from units across the base had requested permission to attend. Nearly 100 people filled the room, more than double the usual attendance. Elena felt the pressure like a physical weight on her shoulders. Everything she had built, everything she and Thornton had worked for, hinged on what happened in this room. She began the way she always did with the story of that day in Thornton's office. But today, she added something she had never shared before. When I walked out of the colonel's office that day, I went to the chapel, she said. I sat in the back pew, and I cried for 2 hours. Not because of what the colonel had said to me, because of what I had finally said to myself. The room was absolutely silent. For 3 years, I had been telling myself that my wounds didn't matter, that my pain wasn't real enough, wasn't visible enough, wasn't important enough to deserve attention. I had internalized every dismissive comment, every skeptical look, every suggestion that I was weak for struggling. Elena paused, feeling the emotion rising in her chest. Showing my scars to Colonel Thornton wasn't really about proving something to him. It was about finally admitting to myself that what I went through was real, that my wounds deserved acknowledgement, that I deserved help. She looked at General Morrison, who had stopped writing and was watching her with glistening eyes. That's what we're trying to build here. Not just a program that teaches leaders to recognize invisible wounds, a culture where soldiers can admit their wounds to themselves, a culture where seeking help is seen as strength, not weakness. A hand went up in the audience. Elena recognized Private David Kim, the young soldier she had counseled weeks ago about his PTSD. Sergeant Vasquez, may I say something? Elena nodded, curious about what the 19-year-old wanted to share. Kim stood up, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice steady. 6 weeks ago, I was planning to kill myself. A gasp rippled through the room. Several officers turned to stare at the young private. I had been having nightmares and panic attacks since my first deployment. I didn't tell anyone because I thought they would think I was weak. I thought my career would be over. I thought I was broken beyond repair. Kim's voice cracked, but he kept going. Then I heard Sergeant Vasquez speak at one of these training sessions. And for the first time I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't broken. I was wounded, and wounds can heal, if you get the right treatment. He looked directly at Elena, tears streaming down his face. I'm in therapy now. I'm on medication that helps with the nightmares. I'm still serving, and my commander knows about my condition and supports me. He took a shaky breath. Sergeant Vasquez saved my life. This program saved my life. The room erupted in applause. Elena felt tears sliding down her own cheeks as she watched the young soldier receive the support he had been afraid to seek. General Morrison stood up and walked to the front of the room. She placed her hand on Kim's shoulder. Private Kim, thank you for your courage. What you just did, standing up in front of all these people and sharing your story that takes more bravery than most people will ever understand. She turned to address the room. This is what we need to replicate. Not just training sessions and policy changes. This. She gestured at Kim, at Elena, at the assembled officers who were wiping their eyes. This culture of courage, this willingness to be vulnerable, this understanding that invisible wounds are real wounds. Morrison looked at Thornton. Colonel, you have something special here, and I intend to make sure the entire army sees it. After the session, General Morrison requested a private meeting with Elena and Thornton. They gathered in the colonel's office, the same room where everything had begun just weeks earlier. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Morrison said. What you've built is impressive, but it's also fragile. It depends on individual commitment and personal relationships. If either of you transfers to a new assignment, the whole thing could collapse. We've thought about that, ma'am, Thornton replied. We're working on documenting everything, creating materials that can be used by other leaders. Documentation isn't enough. We need institutional support, funding, official recognition from Army leadership. Morrison leaned forward. I want to take this to the Secretary of the Army. I want to propose a pilot program that expands what you've done here to 5 other installations. Elena felt her heart skip. Ma'am, that's incredible. It's also risky. If the pilot fails, it won't just hurt the program. It will set back the cause of invisible wound support for years. The skeptics will point to it as proof that this approach doesn't work. What do you need from us? Thornton asked. I need results. Hard data showing measurable improvement in soldier welfare. I need testimonials from commanders who have changed their approach. And most importantly, I need you to be ready to brief the Secretary personally. She turned to Elena. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, I want to recommend you for a direct commission. Second Lieutenant effective immediately upon approval. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept. Say you'll use the authority that comes with officer rank to expand this program. Say you'll help me save soldiers like my daughter and Colonel Thornton's son. Elena looked at Thornton, who was nodding with obvious pride. I accept, ma'am. Good, because we have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it. The news of Elena's commission spread through Fort Bragg within hours. Reactions were mixed, as they always were when an enlisted soldier received a direct commission. Some celebrated her achievement. Others grumbled about favoritism and special treatment. Master Sergeant Chen sought her out in the dining facility that evening. Heard about your promotion, Vasquez. Congratulations. Thank you, Master Sergeant. Chen sat down across from her, his weathered face serious. Listen, I've been in this army a long time. I've seen a lot of rising stars flame out because they got too big too fast. You've got something real here, but you need to be careful. Careful of what? Of forgetting where you came from. Of getting so caught up in briefing generals and changing policies that you lose touch with the soldiers you're supposed to be helping. Chen leaned forward. The moment you stop being Elena Vasquez, the sergeant who showed her scars, and start being Lieutenant Vasquez, the official program spokesperson, you lose everything that made this work. Elena absorbed his words carefully. I hear you, Master Sergeant. I won't forget. See that you don't. Chen stood up to leave, then paused. One more thing. My nephew is stationed at Fort Hood. He's been struggling since his deployment to Syria. I've tried to help him, but he won't talk to me. Says I wouldn't understand. Would you like me to reach out to him? Chen nodded slowly. I would. His name is Specialist Marcus Chen. He's a good kid. He just needs someone who understands what he's going through. I'll contact him tomorrow. Thank you, Vasquez. Lieutenant Vasquez. Chen allowed himself a small smile. That's going to take some getting used to. 3 days later, Elena received a call that changed everything. Lieutenant Vasquez, this is Specialist Chen, Master Sergeant Chen's nephew. He said I should call you. Elena set down the report she had been reviewing. Marcus, thank you for reaching out. How are you doing? A long pause. Not good, ma'am. Not good at all. Tell me what's happening. The story poured out of him, disjointed and emotional. An ambush in Syria. Friends killed. Survivor's guilt that was eating him alive. Nightmares that made sleep impossible. Thoughts of ending it all. Marcus, listen to me carefully. Are you safe right now? I don't know, ma'am. I've got my weapon in my hand. I've been sitting here for an hour trying to decide. Elena's blood ran cold. She kept her voice calm despite the terror flooding her system. Okay, Marcus. I need you to do something for me. Can you set the weapon down? Just set it on the floor beside you. Why? Because I want to talk to you. And I can't do that if I'm worried about what you might do. Will you set it down for me? Another long pause. Then, okay, it's down. Good. That's good, Marcus. Now, I want you to stay on the line with me. Don't hang up no matter what. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. Elena grabbed her phone and started texting Colonel Thornton with her other hand, giving him Marcus's location and asking him to alert Fort Hood's crisis response team. Marcus, tell me about your friends. The ones you lost in Syria. Why, because I want to know them. I want to know who they were. Another pause. Then Marcus began to talk. He told her about Corporal Williams, who had been planning to propose to his girlfriend when he got home. About Specialist Reyes, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations. About Private Thompson, the quietest guy in the unit who had taken a bullet meant for Marcus. I should have died, ma'am. Not them. They had everything to live for. I've got nothing. That's not true, Marcus. You have your uncle who loves you enough to reach out to a stranger for help. You have your fellow soldiers who need you, and you have a future that your friends would want you to live. How do you know what they would want? Elena closed her eyes, thinking of her own lost teammates. Marcus Williams, Rosa Reyes, James Thompson, even their names were similar. Because I lost people too, Marcus. 3 soldiers who died in an IED attack while I survived. For a long time, I thought I should have died instead. I thought surviving was some kind of cosmic mistake. What changed? I realized that living wasn't about me. It was about them. Every day I wake up, every person I help, every life I touch, that's me honoring their memory. That's me making their sacrifice mean something. She heard Marcus's breathing change, becoming steadier. Your friends didn't die so you could follow them, Marcus. They died so you could live. So you could do something with that life that would make them proud. I don't know if I can do that, ma'am. You don't have to know right now. You just have to be willing to try. Can you do that? Can you give yourself one more day to try? A long silence. Elena held her breath. Yeah, Marcus finally said. I can try. 20 minutes later, Fort Hood's crisis response team reached Marcus's barracks. Elena stayed on the phone with him until they arrived, talking about everything and nothing, just keeping him connected to another human voice. When the team finally took over, Elena hung up and collapsed back in her chair. Her hands were shaking. Her uniform was soaked with sweat. Colonel Thornton called within the hour. "Marcus is safe. They've got him in the hospital under observation. The crisis team said your intervention probably saved his life." Elena couldn't speak. The weight of what had just happened was crushing her. "Lieutenant Vasquez, Elena, are you okay?" "I don't know, sir. I honestly don't know." "Listen to me. What you did tonight was extraordinary, but you can't do this alone. We need to build systems that can respond to these situations without requiring one person to bear the entire burden." "I know, sir. I know. Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow about next steps." But Elena didn't rest. She sat in her room staring at the photograph of her convoy team, thinking about all the soldiers like Marcus who were out there right now. Struggling. Suffering. Considering ending their pain permanently. One phone call had saved one life. But how many others were slipping through the cracks? Her phone buzzed with a text from General Morrison. "Heard about tonight. Exceptional work. The secretary wants to meet with you next week. This is your moment. Don't waste it." Elena read the message 3 times. The Secretary of the Army. The person with the power to transform military mental health care across the entire force. She thought about Marcus Chen alive tonight because she had answered a phone call. She thought about Private Kim thriving in treatment because he had heard her story. She thought about all the soldiers who had approached her after training sessions, finally feeling safe enough to admit their invisible wounds. The scars on her chest seemed to pulse with purpose. She had started this journey trying to prove her own wounds were real. Now she had the chance to change how the entire army thought about invisible injuries. Elena picked up her phone and typed a response to General Morrison. "I'll be ready." The Pentagon was everything Elena had imagined, and nothing like she expected. She had prepared for weeks, memorized statistics, rehearsed her presentation until she could deliver it in her sleep. But walking through those corridors past photographs of military leaders who had shaped history, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Colonel Thornton walked beside her, his dress uniform immaculate. General Morrison led the way, her heels clicking against the polished floor with military precision. "Remember," Morrison said without turning around, "the secretary has 15 minutes. Make every word count." "Yes, ma'am." They reached a heavy wooden door guarded by 2 military police officers. Morrison showed her credentials, and they were ushered into an outer office where a civilian aide asked them to wait. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Somewhere beneath her dress uniform, her scars seemed to pulse with anticipation. "Vasquez." She turned to find Thornton watching her with something like fatherly concern. "You've got this. Remember why you're here." "For the soldiers, sir." "Exactly. Not for the politics, not for the promotion. For every soldier who's struggling right now and needs someone to fight for them." The door to the inner office opened, and a silver-haired man in his 60s emerged. Secretary of the Army Robert Chen looked exactly like his photographs, distinguished and serious, but his eyes held a warmth that the official portraits didn't capture. "General Morrison, Colonel Thornton." He shook their hands, then turned to Elena. "And you must be Lieutenant Vasquez. I've heard a great deal about you." "Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm honored to meet you." "The honor is mine. Please come in." His office was surprisingly modest for someone of his position. A few photographs, a flag, a desk covered with papers and briefing books. Secretary Chen gestured for them to sit, then settled into his own chair. "I've reviewed the preliminary data from Fort Bragg," he began. "The numbers are impressive. 40% increase in soldiers seeking treatment. 0 suicide attempts since the program launched. Measurable improvement in unit cohesion and morale." "Yes, sir," Morrison replied. The program has exceeded our expectations. But numbers only tell part of the story. Chen leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Elena. Lieutenant Vasquez, I want to hear from you. Not the official briefing. The real story. Elena took a deep breath. Mr. Secretary, 6 weeks ago, I was called into Colonel Thornton's office because he thought I was faking my medical condition. He laughed at the idea that I might have invisible injuries. Chen's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. I showed him my scars. 47 pieces of shrapnel from an IED attack in Kandahar. 3 of my teammates died in that blast. I've been living with chronic pain nightmares and the constant fear that the fragments still in my body might shift and kill me. She paused, letting the words settle. What happened in that office changed both of us. Colonel Thornton confronted his own failures, including the role he played in his son's suicide. And I finally admitted that my wounds deserved acknowledgement, that I deserved help. Secretary Chen nodded slowly. And from that single confrontation, an entire program emerged. Yes, sir. Because we realized that we weren't unique. There are thousands of soldiers hiding their invisible wounds right now. Afraid of judgment. Afraid of career consequences. Afraid that no one will believe them. What would you do differently if you could start over? The question surprised her. Sir, if you could design this program from scratch with unlimited resources and full institutional support, what would you change? Elena thought carefully before answering. I would start earlier, sir. The problem isn't just how we treat soldiers who are already struggling. It's how we create a culture where struggling is seen as shameful in the first place. Go on. We need to change the conversation from the beginning of a soldier's career. Basic training. Officer candidate school. Every leadership course we offer. We need to teach people that invisible wounds are real wounds, and that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Secretary Chen turned to Thornton. Colonel, you've been remarkably candid about your own failures. That takes courage, especially for someone at your rank. Sir, I've spent 32 years building a reputation on being tough, hard, uncompromising. Thornton's voice was heavy with emotion. That reputation cost me my son. I watched him struggle and told him to tough it out. I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. And now I'm trying to make sure no other parent has to feel what I feel. No other soldier has to die because their leader was too proud to see their pain. The secretary was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up a folder from his desk. I received a letter yesterday from a young private at Fort Hood named Marcus Chen. Any relation to you, by the way? Chen smiled slightly. Distant cousin. Very distant. Private Chen wrote to thank Lieutenant Vasquez for saving his life. He said he had a weapon in his hand when she called him. He was ready to end it, and she talked him through until help arrived. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't known Marcus had written to the secretary. He also said something else. Chen opened the folder and read aloud. Lieutenant Vasquez didn't just save my life that night. She gave me a reason to live. She showed me that my wounds aren't shameful. They're proof that I survived something terrible and that survival matters. He set down the letter and looked at Elena. That's what I needed to hear. Not statistics, not policy proposals. The truth about what this program means to actual soldiers. Secretary Chen stood up and walked to his window, his back to the room. I've been in this job for 3 years. I've overseen budgets, approved deployments, signed letters of condolence to families who lost their children in service to this country. But this decision feels different. He turned to face them. I'm approving the pilot program. 5 installations, full funding, institutional support. We'll call it the Silent Wounds Initiative. Morrison exhaled with visible relief. Thornton's face broke into a rare smile. But I want to go further, Chen continued. I want Lieutenant Vasquez to lead the implementation, not just as a consultant, as the program director. Elena's breath caught. Sir, I'm not sure I'm qualified. You're the most qualified person in this room, Lieutenant. You've lived this. You understand it in a way that no policy expert ever could. He walked back to his desk and sat down. I'm also recommending you for promotion to Captain Effective upon successful completion of the pilot program. Mr. Secretary, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept. Say you'll help me change how this army treats its wounded warriors. Say you'll make sure no more soldiers die because we failed to see their invisible wounds. Elena thought about Marcus Williams, Rosa Reyes, and James Thompson. She thought about Derek Thornton and Sarah Morrison. She thought about all the soldiers still serving who carried wounds no one could see. I accept, sir. Good. Chen stood and extended his hand. Welcome to the fight, Lieutenant Vasquez. Now, let's get to work. The next 6 months were the most intense of Elena's life. She traveled to 5 installations across the country, training commanders speaking to troops building the infrastructure for the Silent Wounds Initiative. Fort Hood, Fort Lewis, Fort Benning, Camp Pendleton, Naval Station Norfolk. At each stop, she encountered the same patterns. Soldiers hiding their struggles, leaders dismissing invisible wounds, a culture of toughness that was killing the people it was supposed to protect. And at each stop she shared her story, showed her scars, watched as hardened military professionals broke down in tears and admitted their own hidden battles. Private Kim, now Specialist Kim, had become her unofficial assistant. He traveled with her, sharing his own testimony, providing living proof that the program worked. You know what the hardest part is, Kim said one evening as they flew between installations. It's not telling my story. It's hearing everyone else's. Elena nodded. Every session I meet soldiers who have been suffering for years, who thought they were alone, who never knew that help was available. How do you handle it? The weight of all those stories. She thought carefully before answering. I remind myself that every story I hear is a person who's finally ready to heal. The weight isn't the burden. It's the proof that we're making a difference. The data supported her words. Across all 5 pilot installations, the numbers were remarkable. Treatment seeking had increased by 60%. Suicide attempts had dropped by 40%. Unit readiness scores had actually improved, contradicting the assumption that addressing mental health issues would undermine combat effectiveness. But the most meaningful feedback came in smaller moments. A gunnery sergeant who approached her after a training session, tears streaming down his face, to say he had finally scheduled an appointment to address the TBI he had been hiding for 3 years. A young lieutenant who admitted she had been planning to resign her commission because she couldn't cope with her PTSD, but had decided to stay and seek treatment instead. A retiring colonel who pulled her aside to confess that he had spent his entire career dismissing soldiers with invisible wounds, and now understood how much damage he had caused. I can't undo what I did, the colonel said. But I can make sure my replacement doesn't make the same mistakes. Elena gave him the training materials and contact information for the program staff. It's never too late to make a difference, sir. As the pilot program neared its 6-month review, Elena received a call that stopped her in her tracks. Lieutenant Vasquez, this is Dr. Rebecca Martinez at Fort Bragg. Elena recognized the voice immediately. Dr. Martinez, is something wrong? I need you to come back to the base as soon as possible. There's been a development with your medical situation. Elena's blood ran cold. What kind of development? I'd rather discuss this in person. But Elena, the doctor's use of her first name was alarming. You need to get here soon. Elena caught the next available flight, her mind racing with possibilities. The shrapnel near her aorta, the fragments against her spine. Had something shifted? Was she dying? She barely slept on the plane, her hand pressed against her chest where the scars mapped her survival. Dr. Martinez was waiting when she arrived at the medical facility. Her expression was serious but not grim, which Elena took as a small comfort. "Thank you for coming so quickly. Please sit down." Elena sat her hands clenched in her lap. "What's happening, ma'am?" "Your latest scans showed something unexpected." Dr. Martinez pulled up images on her computer screen. "The 3 fragments near your aorta have shifted." Elena's heart seemed to stop and shifted. "How bad?" "That's the unexpected part." Dr. Martinez pointed to the screen. "They've shifted away from the aorta, not toward it. What does that mean? It means that for the first time since your injury, those fragments are in a position where they might be safely removable." Elena stared at the screen, unable to process what she was hearing. "We've consulted with the surgical team at Walter Reed," Dr. Martinez continued. "They believe there's a reasonable chance they could extract all 3 fragments with acceptable risk." Acceptable risk? There are no guarantees, Elena. Any surgery near the heart carries danger, but the alternative is living with fragments that could shift again at any time, potentially in a much worse direction. Elena sat in silence, her mind spinning. For 4 years, she had lived with the knowledge that her own body contained the seeds of her potential death. The fragments had been too dangerous to remove, so she had simply learned to coexist with them. Now she had a choice, a chance. "How long do I have to decide? The surgical team at Walter Reed has an opening next month. If you want to do this, that's your window." Elena left the medical facility in a daze. She walked without direction, her feet carrying her automatically, while her mind wrestled with the impossible decision. Surgery could free her from the constant fear. No more worrying about whether this headache was just stress or a sign that something had shifted. No more lying awake at night imagining the fragments working their way through her heart. But surgery could also kill her. One slip, one unexpected complication. She could survive Kandahar only to die on an operating table in Maryland. Her phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Thornton. "Heard you're back on base. Everything okay?" She stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Finally, she typed back, "Can we talk? I need advice." They met at the same chapel where Elena had cried for 2 hours after first showing her scars. It seemed fitting that the most important conversations of her life kept happening in this small, quiet space. Thornton listened without interruption as she explained the medical development. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What does your gut tell you?" "I don't know, sir. I've spent 4 years learning to live with these fragments. They've become part of who I am in a strange way. And now you have the chance to let them go." Elena nodded. "But what if the surgery goes wrong?" "The program is at a critical point. The 6-month review is next week. If something happens to me—" "Stop." Thornton's voice was firm. "Don't make this decision based on the program. The program will survive without you. The question is whether you want to survive without the fragments." Elena looked at him surprised by the clarity of his words. "You've spent the last 6 months teaching soldiers that their lives matter more than their duties," Thornton continued. "That seeking help is strength, not weakness. Are you going to follow your own advice?" The question cut through all her rationalizations. "I'm scared, sir." "Of course you are. You'd be crazy not to be." Thornton placed a hand on her shoulder. "But you've faced worse. You've survived worse, and whatever you decide, you won't face it alone." Elena returned to Washington for the 6-month review, but her mind was divided between the presentation and the decision waiting for her. The review was held in the same Pentagon conference room where she had first met Secretary Chen. But now the room was filled with generals and admirals from every service branch, civilian officials from the Department of Defense, and representatives from Congress. The data she presented was overwhelming. Every metric showed improvement. Every installation reported success. The Silent Wounds Initiative had exceeded every expectation. "The question before us," Secretary Chen said after Elena finished her presentation, "is whether to expand this program to every installation in the Department of Defense." A 4-star general from the Marine Corps spoke up. "Mr. Secretary, the numbers are impressive, but I have concerns about scalability. What works at 5 installations may not work at 50. Elena stepped forward. "General, with respect, the program works because it changes culture, not just policy. And culture change scales when leaders model the behavior they expect. Lieutenant Vasquez, you're asking us to fundamentally transform how we think about mental health in the military. That's a massive undertaking." "Yes, sir, it is. But the alternative is continuing to lose soldiers to invisible wounds, continuing to send service members home damaged and unsupported, continuing to pretend that toughness alone is enough to survive what we ask our people to endure." She paused, gathering herself for what she was about to say. "In 2 weeks, I'm having surgery to remove shrapnel fragments that have been lodged near my heart for 4 years. There's a chance I won't survive the procedure." The room went silent. Even Secretary Chen looked surprised. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. Every soldier with invisible wounds lives with uncertainty. Every day we wonder if this will be the day something breaks. Every night we wrestle with demons that no one else can see." Elena's voice strengthened. "This program gives soldiers hope. It tells them that their wounds are real and their lives matter. It creates a culture where seeking help is honored, not punished." She looked around the room at the assembled leaders. "If I don't survive my surgery, I want to know that I left behind something that will keep helping soldiers long after I'm gone." Secretary Chen stood up slowly. "Lieutenant Vasquez, I think I speak for everyone in this room when I say we expect you to survive your surgery and continue leading this program for many years to come." He paused. "But if you're asking whether we're going to approve the expansion, the answer is yes." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. "Effective immediately, the Silent Wounds Initiative will be implemented across all Department of Defense installations. We will provide full funding, institutional support, and a clear mandate that caring for invisible wounds is a command responsibility, not an optional extra." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't care. "Furthermore," Chen continued, "I am recommending Lieutenant Vasquez for the Legion of Merit for her extraordinary contributions to the welfare of service members, and I am personally requesting that she accept a position as Special Advisor to the Secretary of the Army for Invisible Wound Support, effective upon her recovery from surgery." The room erupted in applause. General Morrison was crying. Colonel Thornton was beaming with pride. Even the skeptical Marine Corps general was nodding with what looked like respect. Elena stood at attention, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. "Lieutenant Vasquez," Secretary Chen said, extending his hand, "thank you for your service. Thank you for your courage. And thank you for showing us what we needed to see." Elena shook his hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for listening, for believing, for giving invisible wounds the recognition they deserve." As she left the Pentagon that evening, Elena paused on the steps and looked back at the massive building. Somewhere inside those walls, decisions were being made that would affect every soldier in the armed forces, decisions that she had helped shape. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. "Walter Reed confirmed. Surgery scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Are you ready? Elena looked at the message, then up at the evening sky. The scars on her chest seemed to pulse with something that felt like hope. She typed her response. I'm ready. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The night before surgery. Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her hospital bed at Walter Reed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft beeps of monitors and the distant footsteps of nurses making their rounds. Tomorrow morning, surgeons would cut open her chest and attempt to remove fragments of metal that had been part of her body for 4 years. She might wake up free, or she might not wake up at all. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. A text from Colonel Thornton. Can't sleep either. Wanted you to know I'm praying for you. Not something I do often, but tonight feels right. Elena smiled and typed back. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. Another buzz. This one from Specialist Kim. The whole unit is thinking about you tonight, ma'am. We made a banner. It says Vasquez Strong. It's hanging in the dining facility. Then another from Dr. Martinez. The surgical team is the best in the country. You're in excellent hands. See you on the other side. Then General Morrison. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you've already changed everything. You've already won. The messages kept coming. Soldiers she had trained, officers she had counseled, service members whose lives she had touched over the past 6 months. Each one carrying words of encouragement, gratitude, and hope. Elena read every message, letting the love wash over her like a warm tide. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on her door. Come in. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside. It took Elena a moment to recognize him in the dim light. Marcus Chen, the soldier. She had talked down from suicide months ago, stood awkwardly near the door. He was wearing civilian clothes, and he looked healthier than the last time she had seen him. Stronger. I hope it's okay that I came, ma'am. I flew in from Fort Hood when I heard about your surgery. Marcus, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He moved closer, his eyes glistening. You saved my life, Lieutenant Vasquez. I had a gun in my hand. I was ready to end it. And you stayed on the phone with me until help arrived. Elena felt tears prick her own eyes. I just talked to you, Marcus. The strength was yours. No, ma'am. The strength was yours. You gave it to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. I wanted to give you this. For luck. He placed it in her hand. It was a challenge coin custom made. On one side was the Silent Wounds Initiative logo. On the other side was an inscription, You are not alone. The unit had these made, Marcus explained. Everyone who's been through the program gets one. We wanted you to have the first. Elena closed her fingers around the coin, feeling its weight in her palm. Thank you, Marcus. I'll carry it with me tomorrow. You're going to be fine, ma'am. I know it, because you're the strongest person I've ever met. After Marcus left, Elena held the coin against her chest, right over the scars that had started everything. For the first time all night, she felt something like peace. She closed her eyes and finally slept. The surgical team arrived at 6 in the morning. James Patterson, the lead surgeon, was a quiet man with steady hands and kind eyes. He had performed hundreds of similar procedures, but he understood that to Elena, this was the only one that mattered. How are you feeling, Lieutenant? Terrified, sir, but ready. That's exactly how you should feel. He checked her vitals one more time. We're going to take good care of you. When you wake up, those fragments will be gone. And if I don't wake up, Dr. Patterson met her eyes directly. Then you'll have lived a life that mattered. You'll have helped more people in 6 months than most of us help in a lifetime. He squeezed her hand. But you're going to wake up Elena. I'm confident of that. The anesthesiologist approached with a syringe. We're ready to begin, Lieutenant. I need you to count backward from 10. Elena gripped the challenge coin in her left hand. With her right hand, she touched the scars on her chest one last time. 10, 9, 8, 7. The world went dark. Colonel Thornton sat in the waiting room, unable to sit still. He had flown to Washington the moment he heard about Elena's surgery date. General Morrison was there too, along with Secretary Chen, who had cleared his entire morning schedule. Dr. Martinez had driven up from Fort Bragg. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, united by their concern for the woman who had changed all of their lives. How long is the procedure supposed to take? Thornton asked for the third time. 4 to 6 hours, Morrison replied, depending on what they find when they get in there. 4 to 6 hours. An eternity of waiting. Thornton stood up and walked to the window. He thought about the first time Elena had walked into his office, how certain he had been that she was faking her condition. How wrong he had been about everything. She's going to make it, Secretary Chen said quietly. She's too stubborn to die on an operating table. She's also too important, Morrison added. The universe doesn't take people like Elena Vasquez before their work is done. Thornton wanted to believe them, but he had learned long ago that the universe didn't care about importance or work or potential. The universe took who it wanted when it wanted, without regard for fairness or justice. He thought about Derek. His son had been important too. His son had had work left to do, and the universe had taken him anyway. 2 hours passed, then 3, then 4. At the 5-hour mark, the waiting room door opened and Dr. Patterson walked in. His surgical mask was pulled down around his neck. His expression was unreadable. Everyone stood up simultaneously. The surgery was successful, Patterson said. The collective exhale was audible. We removed all 3 fragments from near her aorta, plus 2 additional pieces we discovered during the procedure. She's in recovery now, and she's stable. Morrison grabbed Thornton's arm for support. Secretary Chen closed his eyes in relief. When can we see her? Thornton asked. She should be awake in about an hour. 1 visitor at a time until she's stronger. I'll wait, Chen said. The colonel should go first. Thornton looked at him in surprise. Mr. Secretary, you started this journey with her colonel. You should be there when she opens her eyes. 1 hour later, Thornton stood beside Elena's bed in the recovery room. She looked small, surrounded by monitors and tubes, but her color was good, and her breathing was steady. The challenge coin from Marcus Chen sat on her bedside table within easy reach. Thornton pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down to wait. 20 minutes later, Elena's eyes fluttered open. Colonel, her voice was barely a whisper, rough from the breathing tube. I'm here, Elena. The surgery was successful. They got all the fragments. She blinked slowly, processing the information. All of them. All of them. 5 pieces total. You're free. Tears slid from the corners of Elena's eyes into her hair. I didn't think I'd wake up. I knew you would. You're too stubborn to die. Elena laughed weakly, then winced at the pain in her chest. Don't make me laugh, sir. Everything hurts. Good. That means you're alive. She reached out and grasped his hand. Thank you for being here. There's nowhere else I would be. Thornton squeezed her hand gently. You've got a lot of visitors waiting. Secretary Chen, General Morrison, Dr. Martinez, half the soldiers from Fort Bragg, it seems like. They came. Of course they came. You changed their lives, Elena. They weren't going to let you face this alone. Elena closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the love surrounding her. For so long she had carried her wounds in isolation, afraid to let anyone see her vulnerability. Now she was surrounded by people who had seen her at her worst, and loved her anyway. "I think I need to sleep, sir." "Then sleep. We'll be here when you wake up." Thornton sat with her until her breathing deepened into the rhythm of peaceful sleep. Then he stepped out to give the others their chance to see her. The recovery was harder than Elena expected. The surgery had removed the fragments, but her body needed time to heal from the trauma of the procedure itself. For 2 weeks, she remained at Walter Reed, enduring physical therapy, managing pain, and slowly rebuilding her strength. But she wasn't alone. A rotating cast of visitors kept her company throughout her recovery. Specialist Kim came every day after his shift, bringing news from the program and bad jokes that made Elena groan. Colonel Thornton called every morning and every evening, checking on her progress and updating her on developments at Fort Bragg. General Morrison stopped by whenever her schedule allowed, bringing books and magazines and the latest data on the program's expansion. And Secretary Chen made time for a personal visit that lasted nearly 2 hours, during which he talked to Elena, not as a subordinate, but as a fellow human being who had been touched by her story. "You know," Chen said near the end of his visit, "when I first heard about what happened at Fort Bragg, I thought it was just another feel-good story that would fade away in a few months. Programs come and go in this building. Most of them don't survive the bureaucracy." "What changed your mind, sir?" "You did. When you stood in that conference room and told us you might not survive your surgery, but you wanted to make sure the program would survive without you." He shook his head. "That's when I knew this was different. That's when I knew we had to make it work." On the day Elena was finally cleared for discharge, she received a package at the hospital. Inside was a small wooden box with a brass plaque attached. The plaque read, "Williams Reyes Thompson Memorial Center for Invisible Wounds, dedicated in honor of Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez." A note was attached in Colonel Thornton's handwriting. "While you were recovering, we broke ground on a new facility at Fort Bragg. It will be the first dedicated center for invisible wound support in the Army. The families of your fallen teammates agreed to let us use their names. They wanted you to know that their loved one's sacrifice wasn't meaningless. What you've built in their memory will save thousands." Elena held the box against her chest and wept. 6 months later, Captain Elena Vasquez stood at a podium in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. The room was filled with the most senior military leaders in the country. Generals, admirals, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, representatives from Congress, and in the front row, the people who had been with her from the beginning. Colonel Thornton, recently promoted to Brigadier General, sat with tears streaming down his weathered face. General Morrison, who had lost her daughter to invisible wounds, watched with fierce pride. Secretary Chen, who had taken a chance on a young sergeant with scars on her chest and fire in her heart, nodded with satisfaction. And Marcus Chen, the soldier, who had nearly died with a gun in his hand, stood at attention with the challenge coin visible on his uniform. The Secretary of Defense stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to recognize extraordinary service to our nation. Captain Elena Vasquez has been awarded the Legion of Merit for her contributions to the welfare of service members across all branches of the armed forces." Applause filled the room. "But more importantly," the Secretary continued, "we are here to celebrate a transformation. In the past year, the Silent Wounds Initiative has been implemented at every military installation in the world. treatment seeking for invisible wounds has increased by 70%. Suicide rates have dropped by 45%. And for the first time in modern military history, we have a culture that honors invisible wounds as readily as visible ones. He turned to Elena. Captain Vasquez, this is your legacy. Not the medal we're about to present. Not the title or the position, but the thousands of soldiers who are alive today because you had the courage to show your scars. Elena stepped forward to accept the medal. As the secretary pinned it to her uniform, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. A colonel's cruel laugh in a small office, a moment of rage that led to revelation, a transformation that started with one man and spread across an entire military. After the ceremony, Elena found a moment alone near the memorial wall. She touched the place on her chest where her scars remained. The surgeons had removed the shrapnel, but the scars would never fully disappear. She didn't want them to. They were part of her story, part of who she had become. Captain Vasquez. She turned to find a young soldier in a wheelchair, fresh from a deployment, eyes hollow, with the 1,000-yard stare she knew too well. His uniform showed the insignia of an infantry unit that had seen heavy combat. I'm Private First Class Rodriguez, ma'am. I just got back from Afghanistan 2 weeks ago. His voice cracked. I've been having nightmares, panic attacks. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I keep seeing my friends die over and over again. Elena knelt beside his wheelchair, bringing herself to his eye level. What's your first name, Private? Michael, ma'am. Michael, listen to me carefully. She placed her hand over his. What you're experiencing is real. Your wounds are real, and they deserve treatment just as much as any bullet wound or shrapnel injury. But I don't have any visible injuries, ma'am. I feel like I'm faking it. Elena understood that feeling better than anyone alive. I spent 4 years hiding scars that covered half my body, she said. I had 47 pieces of shrapnel pulled out of me, and I still thought my pain wasn't real enough to deserve attention. I was wrong, Michael. And so are you. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, the same one Marcus had given her the night before her surgery. This is for you. It's a reminder that you're not alone, that there's a whole community of warriors who understand what you're going through. And that seeking help isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you can do. Michael took the coin with trembling hands. Thank you, ma'am. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. You just have to promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me you'll get help. Promise me you'll let the doctors and counselors do their job. Promise me you won't give up. Michael looked at the coin, then at Elena, and for the first time since his return, something like hope flickered in his eyes. I promise, ma'am. Good. Elena stood up and helped adjust his wheelchair. Now let me introduce you to some people who are going to take very good care of you. She wheeled Michael toward the group of program staff members who were waiting nearby. As she handed him off to a counselor who specialized in combat trauma, she caught Brigadier General Thornton watching her from across the room. He nodded once, a gesture of respect and recognition. Elena nodded back. Later that evening, Elena sat alone in her hotel room looking at the Legion of Merit medal in its velvet case. It was beautiful, prestigious, the kind of recognition that most soldiers never received. But it wasn't what mattered most. She picked up her phone and opened the photograph she kept as her home screen. Her convoy team taken days before the attack. Marcus Williams, Rosa Reyes, James Thompson. 3 faces frozen in time, forever young, forever lost. We did it, she whispered to them. We built something that will help soldiers for generations. Your deaths meant something. Your sacrifice created something beautiful. The faces in the photograph didn't answer. They never would. But Elena no longer needed them to. She had spent 4 years wondering why she survived when they didn't. Now she understood. Her survival wasn't random. It was purpose. Every scar on her body was a reminder of what she had endured and what she was meant to accomplish. Her phone buzzed with a final message of the day. It was from Michael Rodriguez, the young soldier in the wheelchair. "Ma'am, I just finished my first counseling session. It was hard, but I feel like I can breathe again. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing in me. I'm going to make it because of you." Elena read the message 3 times, feeling its weight settle into her heart. She thought about all the soldiers like Michael, the ones still struggling in silence, the ones afraid to ask for help, the ones carrying wounds that no one could see. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But for the first time in her life, Elena knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She set down her phone and touched the scars on her chest one final time. They no longer marked what she had lost. They proclaimed what she had become: a warrior, a healer, a voice for the voiceless. The shrapnel was gone, but the mission remained. And Elena Vasquez was just getting started.